How are y'all doing?
Good.
Good. I'm Maury Nicely, and I'm an attorney here in town, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the history of Chattanooga's riverfront and where we're going. We're going to pack 200 years of history into about 6 minutes, so we're going to be moving fast, so bear with me. In 2 years, we're coming up to the 200th anniversary of Ross's Landing, and the landing, the riverfront, is sort of where this community was born. And we're starting to see ourselves, since 1992, going back to it. So let's talk about the history a little bit. In 1815, Ross's Landing was founded by John Ross. We're going to see him in a minute. And John Ross was a Cherokee Indian. He was actually only 1/8 Cherokee. He was 7/8 Scottish. But back in those days, that was enough to be a Cherokee, and he later became the principal chief of the Cherokee Nation. But he came here to Chattanooga, and the question is, well, why did he found this town here? Well, his grandfather had a trading camp about 7 miles away in a little town that now is known as Rossville. And this is his father's cabin. It's now known as the John Ross cabin. And Chattanooga, Ross's Landing, was the closest place to that cabin where they could offload goods from the river and bring them up to this cabin. So he founded a little spot called Ross's Landing in this area. And he founded it in 1815, lived there for a number of years. In 1835, the Treaty of New Echota moved the Cherokee Indians west on the Trail of Tears, and the town of Chattanooga was founded in the 1830s. This is the first map of the city. If you were beyond MLK Boulevard, you were out of town. And all of the growth really centered very close to the river in early years, and so much of the town was from really 4th Street down to the river, and it's where people lived. But in 1850, the railroad came to town, and this is a picture around MLK where the railroad was. And they said, okay, you can build a railroad here, but we want you to bring it to the river as well. So they started building it along Broad Street, which was called Railroad Avenue. But eventually it became too pricey, and they eventually didn't fulfill the railroad line down to the river, which is great, because we don't have railroad lines and railroad buildings down by the river now. We instead became an industrial landing. This is an 1858 picture of the landing looking up toward the bluff where the Hunter is. And it was really an area where flatboats and riverboats came and unloaded goods. And because of that, the businesses that grew around it were businesses that would use those goods, like a lot of lumber businesses. And so that was one big development, was the fact that the railroad didn't make it to the river. Another big development was the Civil War. And in 1864, the Union Army built its first bridge across the river. And this was called the Meigs Military Bridge. It's about where the Market Street Bridge was. But it was built out of timber and wood. It was really unstable. And in 1867, it floated away in a flood. And so for years, there was no bridge across the river. But the Union Army put a lot of money and a lot of development into town. One thing that was really big down at the river, this is about where the Ojati Bridge is now, were the shipyards. These were Federal Army shipyards. You can see the big shipyard building. And on the right, you can barely see where they would build the boats, and they would let the steamboats slide down into the river, and we were a big steamboat building area. So this was really an industrial area, not park. No one lived down here, and there was really no way across the river except for this swing ferry. And this is around where McClellan Island was, and it was basically boats that were lashed to McClellan Island, and the current would carry people back and forth. And that was how you got across the river, which delayed development for a number of years until 1891. Man, this is fast. And the Walnut Street Bridge was built in 1891. It's actually called the Hamilton County Bridge. And you're going to see in these next pictures a lot of steamboats and things. This is one of my favorite, the Gospel Ark. This was a floating tabernacle that stayed down by the river for a number of years. But you can see this was really a steamboat area, but the bridges are starting to be built, so you can start to see the development of North Chattanooga. The second bridge across was built in 1915, the Market Street Bridge. Its official name is the Chief John Ross Bridge. And here you see another steamboat. This was the locally built Joe Wheeler. And the steamboats would bring people and goods up and down the river, and that continued really until the 1920s. And the next slide, you'll really see what the wharf looked like. And no one called this the riverfront or the waterfront. It was called the City of Chattanooga Wharf. And it was a working industrial landing. You can see these huge riverboats that came up to the landing, and you can see all of the business buildings. People didn't live there. People didn't come there to hang out or to fish. This was an industrial area with a lot of businesses and a lot of lumber businesses. In the next slide, you're going to see a picture from Cameron Hill looking down during one of the floods. And if you look down on the bottom left, you can see really one of the biggest businesses, and it was the Loomis and Hart Lumber Company. A lot of lumber was brought down by river, and this was a furniture manufactory that also built other things out of wood. And that was really one of the businesses there for a long time. Over time, though, as river travel became less prominent, the area really became stilted and didn't develop further. And in the 1950s, the Golden Gateway Urban Redevelopment Project was really the first bid at redeveloping. You can see the Ojati Bridge and what is now Bell South Park, that was a football field. But you can still see Loomis and Hart down there on the riverfront. And they were there really until the 1960s and 70s when they began to be torn down. Again, as the river became less important, other things around the river did. Some of you probably remember when the Walnut Street Bridge looked like this. In the 1970s was closed, and for years they thought it was going to be torn down. But eventually, in the late 1980s and 1990s, it was renovated, reopened, and we all know what it is now. And that was really the first piece of downtown redevelopment. The biggest piece, and I'm not just saying this to brown nose because we're here, but it was in 1992 and was the Tennessee Aquarium. And even though a lot of people really questioned whether this was a folly to build an aquarium here, this really became the anchor for Chattanooga's redevelopment. And that continued through to 2002 with the 21st Century Riverfront Project, which you can see in this slide where we have the second phase of the riverfront. And really, this is when the area ceased looking like a wharf. Those of you who remember before 2002, it still kind of looked like a wharf area. And now it's redeveloped into really what they called at the time Chattanooga's Lawn, where people could come and play. And a big key piece of it also on the left was the Cherokee Passage. Chattanooga and Ross's Landing, as many of you know, was the spot where the Cherokee Trail of Tears began. And this was a big piece of the redevelopment to try to not only recognize that history, but sort of to serve as a healing piece of the 21st century waterfront. And now the next thing that's going to be coming down the pike is about this time next year, and you'll see in the next two slides, an outdoor and an indoor picture of them, is the Chattanooga History Center. And the History Center is going to open on the Aquarium Plaza. And it's going to be a little bit different, and not the History Center that you're sort of used to where you go, 1796, 1797, 1798. It's going to be a little bit more thematic, and it's going to be looking at, how this town developed. What are the big pieces of key history that we played a part in? What are the industries and the innovations? Why do people want to live in this unique and wonderful place? And so hopefully this will be the next step in sort of the history of this great place and sort of our return to the river in Chattanooga. Thank you very much.